Welcome to our Learning Together session here at AeroPM today. Today we've got Tim Webster here, who is currently working as the ILS lead at Land 154, and he's going to be talking to us all today about planning and conduct of transition of support responsibility. So thanks very much, Tim, for coming along today and to present this presentation today. If you have any questions, please ask Tim along the way, but I'm going to hand over to Tim now and we'll go from there. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks everyone for dialing in and joining us. As Adam mentioned, the subject for today is planning and conduct of transition of support responsibility. My plan will be to go through this, share key points and lessons I've learned through experiencing this in the past. My background is very much land and joint domain, but focusing in the land space experience. Please speak up, share stories, ask questions as we go, because I'd very much like to learn from this process as well as to be able to share my experience with everyone else as we step through it. I'll ask for input at points as we go through, but again, feel free to speak up and ask a question or share a story just as we step through and you feel you've got something to add. So presentation scope, I plan to work through, and first one I want to clarify and talk through is just what I mean by transition and what portion of transition I plan to talk to, because as I'm sure all of you will be quite familiar with, in the defence environment or anywhere really, people can have a lot of different understandings of what the same term means. And I've found in the past that when I start discussing transition related activities and planning with stakeholders, we haven't always started out on the same page. So I thought that was worth just beginning with to make sure that there's a common understanding of what aspect of transition I'm going to work through. Then we'll move on and talk about transition planning at each of the different stages of the capability life cycle, where my experience has said we should be focusing and lessons I've learned at each stage. Again, open it up and seek any input or thoughts from people as we go through there. Discuss the key stakeholders in transition, some of them very, very obvious, some of them possibly less so. Run through a list of resources that I've found useful in planning for and executing transition, a bit of a conclusion and a question session at the end. So first of all, again, the meaning of transition. So before I put up the list of everything I've come up with, I'm interested, just open to the forum, what do people understand transition to mean? Would anyone like to share your initial understanding of that phrase before we've actually gone through and spoken against it? No? All right. So again, I went through, brainstormed a number of different subjects. The somewhat humorous one, transition out of the uniform. It seems silly to have to bring that up and mention it, but I actually have had a conversation with someone previously where I started talking about planning transition, and they actually did think I was discussing leaving the ADF and moving into the civilian arena. That is not what I intend to talk about today, but that just sort of highlights the differences in understanding that people can have. The area that I think is more interesting and more important to cover, in a lot of CASG policy and guidance, the terminology of transition is jointly used to cover introduction into service, or the capability introduction to the users, and also the transition of support responsibility from a acquisition project office into a sustainment organization, into a SPO. A lot of the time, the templates and guidance will appear to be driving you towards doing both of those in the same document set. This is one of those areas where my prior experience has found that it makes things a lot cleaner and a lot simpler to have one set of planning and documentation, one forum for that capability acceptance into service, and a separate set of planning and documentation for the transition of support arrangements. Linked into that second one is also the transfer of support arrangements from one contractor to another. So from one prime support contractor to another, or from the support arrangements that have been established and the support resources that are established under an acquisition contractor into a support contractor under a ongoing as DEFCON support contract. Again, has anyone else got any thoughts or different interpretations on what transition might mean? No? All right. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so transition and the capability lifecycle. Capability lifecycle stretches from strategy and concepts prior to any kind of government approval, prior to gate one, all the way through to in-service and disposal. And transition planning should be occurring and engagement should be happening at more or less every single step of the CLC. There are different focuses and different products that should be getting developed at each of those stages. And as I step through the next few slides, I'll go into what those products are, the areas of focus, and again, the lessons I've learned as to where risks may arise or particular lessons learned that I've picked up at each of those stages. Again, in the land environment primarily, but I've had experience working in all of these phases up to pretty much the introduction to service. I haven't actually worked in disposal. So if anyone in the line, when we get to that point, feels like they have something to share, please do, because I have less to contribute in that space. I've highlighted the acquisition and sustainment slides red because stage red, because the bulk of the transition conduct and work is done in that stage, even though planning has to begin much earlier. All right. Prior to gate zero, when you're at the very, very, very early stages, there is a requirement within the CASG process to conduct a product transition risk assessment, document any risks that have been identified in the project execution strategy. Previously, the sort of things that I've looked at there and what I think is useful to identify is any risks associated with the support organization you might be moving towards. And what I mean by that is a lot of the time, and particularly in land, I've found a lot of the time our experience has found that when you have identified a SPO that's going to receive the capability at the end of the capability life cycle, they have a particular way of working and they have a experience in managing particular types of contracts, particular types of structures, particular types of support arrangements. And identifying where and what change management might need to be done is something that is worth flagging early and engaging early on. Has anyone else got any risks that they'd like to raise or experience, or anything that you'd like to ask further on risks to be identified at the pre-gate zero stage of the capability lifecycle?
Mark Smith here. I've got a very quick question for you. Have you ever highlighted back to CASG about one of the risks, obviously, of their personnel changing and perhaps not even having the level of expertise needed for a new capability coming on board?
Yes, I have, although in fairness, that wasn't actually at the gate zero stage. But in one of the previous projects, and I'm afraid I'm not going to go into the specific details of which project and what the SPO was due to commercial and the usual defence sensitivities, but I have had a capability where we were introducing a holistic turnkey support contract that was going to be performance-based contracting, and the support organisation had only had experience managing very defined transactional-based work. They were not used to managing that type of contract, and what that actually meant is that that support organisation had no skills and expertise at that point in time in managing performance-based contracts. That was a key risk to highlight, both within the project office, but also to the SPO executive, because obviously it makes very little sense to implement a performance-based contract to transition to sustainment if CASG, if the Commonwealth is unable to manage that. So the way that we addressed that risk was working with the SPO early on to identify who the eventual contract manager was going to be. And we actually went and got them involved in the tender development, in the evaluation of the responses. They were intimately involved in the development of the performance-based contracting framework and went along to the training sessions that were run by the performance-based contracting cell with us. They upskilled 2 staff members specifically to be able to learn to manage and handle the type of contract they were going to be receiving on transition of support. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Did anyone have anything else you wanted to discuss on this point, or should we move on? Okay. So next one is the transition of activity or transition planning that needs to happen by gate 1. So again, when you look at the CASG policy and guidance documentation, from gate 0 through to gate 2, there's this big block that they've just called transition planning, and there's a whole lot of detail underneath that, but it doesn't give you it doesn't give you a lot of specific detail about what should be done by gate 1 versus gate 2, at least not my interpretation of that. So the way that I've dealt with that in the past in the 2 projects that I've been working on the approval documentation, the project planning documentation, is by gate 1, the goal is, first of all, you have to have identified who the sustainment organization is eventually going to be. That is probably known by gate 0, but if not, we need to have that identified at gate 1. And the initial transition planning, depending on the complexity of the system, the approach to transition that is eventually going to be taken, you may go down the path of a draft transition plan or roll the early transition planning into the integrated project management plan. So I've usually gone down the second path and included a degree of transition planning in the IPMP or a early ILS plan if you have it. The main reason being it is early stages planning at that point, and both the IPMP and the ILSP tend to go through the same sort of stakeholders that you're trying to get the attention of at the gate 1 window. It is important to have that early planning identified, and also to identify in that IPMP or transition plan or ILS plan, whichever particular document set you're going to work with, what the additional work is that needs to be done between gate 1 and gate 2 to refine that transition planning. So this might be where you identify whether it is specifically planned to reach out to the sustainment organization and get them involved in the RFT development process, in the evaluation, as mentioned earlier. I think there is a massive amount of value in doing exactly that, but obviously that depends on the resource availability of the sustainment organization. If you're going to a SPO that only has 1 or 2 people and they are managing a prime contractor, they may not have the capacity to provide significant support. But as much as possible, I'm always a fan of lean forwards, engage with the key stakeholders as early as possible and invite their input, because the last thing that you want to do is run through a whole transition plan, design a support system, implement it, only to hand it over to a support organization that either doesn't agree with what you've established or is not equipped to be able to manage those support arrangements. And the way to address that risk is to engage early, engage extensively to the greatest extent possible within the resourcing limitations, obviously, and get that stakeholder buy-in. Any other thoughts or questions on transition up to gate 1? Okay, so we'll move on to gate 2 now. As mentioned before, the gate 0 to gate 2 window is when all the transition, or when the main bulk of the transition planning is supposed to occur. Again, as per CASG policy, we are required to have a transition plan complete by gate 2. It doesn't technically form part of tier 1 or 2 documentation for the government submission. However, it should be getting referred to in the IPMP. It should be getting referred to in the ILS plan that you also have to have developed at that stage. For those that may have worked in transition planning and execution in the past, something that I've noticed recently in the CASG guidance is up until maybe 2 years ago, the transition planning that I'd been exposed to was very, very granular. It was to identify all of the artifacts that need to be transitioned, to identify every single step and process that needed to be done. And that resulted in a hundreds of lines long spreadsheet of these are all the activities that need to be done, the specific stakeholders, when, by, signed off by whom. That doesn't quite align with what the current transition plan template says. There is a transition register and a transition artifact list that there are also templates for, but those and that level of granular detail appears to be something that is flagged for between gate 2 and effectively the commencement of actually transitioning, actually doing introduction to service. But prior to gate 2, you have to have planned out effectively what is the transition organization, who are the authorities, who are the stakeholders that you need to be engaging with and get support from. You have to have defined, whether in the transition plan or the IPMP project schedule and cost model, but you have to have defined how much work the project is going to be doing and how it is going to be resourced to support transition planning and conduct. Because once you get gate 2 approval, the project schedule, scope, and budget is locked in. And if you have not planned out, at least in broad strokes, what transition planning activities need to be done and who needs to be available to do it, you might find yourself in a situation where you've effectively run out of resourcing to do that work. Again, in the lead up to gate 2, I believe that you should be engaging all of the stakeholders that have particular key interest in the transition of support responsibility, because they will need to inform the planning how much engagement that is to be done prior to gate 2. And they also should be reviewing and providing input into the sustainment cost estimates and personnel requirements, which is what you get in the NPOC. Again, whilst the acquisition budget and schedule is locked in at gate 2, you're supposed to have a reasonably firm estimate on sustainment funding and personnel requirements, which would include any personnel changes that are required in the sustainment organisation. And this might be where, you know, as per the conversation earlier, requirements to upskill or get additional personnel in to manage contracts rather than do transactional based work needs to get addressed. If that is not identified until after gate 2, it becomes much harder to change the budget, change the resource profile of, in particular, CASG, because that's where my experience has been focused. But, you know, equally that would apply to transitioning elements of support to organizations other than CASG, whether that be CIOG or a ADF training organization, or even if you're transitioning portions of support into part of one of the service headquarters. Any questions, comments on gate 2? Has anyone got any stories of what they have been through in the lead up to gate 2 and transition planning at that stage that they'd like to share? Okay. Then towards the end of it, the last stages of the CLC during acquisition, in service and disposal. So pretty much right from when you get gate 2 approval, you're in acquisition stage. And at that point, you start executing the transition plan. Typically speaking, that will involve holding regular formal transition review meetings or transition workshops, but the current templates call them transition review meetings. Those should be held on a regular planned basis where all of the decision makers in the organizations involved in that transition are present to either agree and sign off on what has been done to date, or agree and commit resources to progressing the transition further. The transition workshops, so CASG's recommendation is from about DDR onwards, so detailed design review onwards, is when the formal transition workshop should be commencing. I believe that you should be starting transition engagements, even if it's through smaller focused informal transition workshops ahead of that. but the formal process with documented minutes, building and populating the transition register should be occurring from DDR onwards. Most of the transition execution phases that I've worked with, we've split that transition engagement in the execution space into a roughly quarterly transition review forum where you have the main decision authorities. And then on top of that, we have had lower level focused working groups on a monthly basis or more often as required, where specific bodies of work that have been raised and agreed in those formal transition review meetings receive that focused work and are progressed so that you can report back to the transition review board or the transition review meetings on that quarterly basis. The frequency, duration, and when you start all of this obviously is going to depend on the duration of your project's life cycle, the project introductory space. A lot of the land projects that I've been involved in have been high-paced, smaller technology pieces. So we can go from gate to approval to introduction to service occurring in a space of 2 years. Obviously, if you are dealing with a project that takes 5, 10 more years, which does occur in some of the larger projects, particularly in Navy and Air, then the duration, the frequency of those transition workshops obviously needs to be adjusted and suit the specific nature of the capability that you are working with. Those formal transition review meetings are the forum that very detailed spreadsheet that I mentioned earlier, the list of the transition artifacts and responsibilities, specific troops to task, so to speak. Those should be getting identified, updated, and agreed at each and every transition review meeting. And stakeholders assigned to do that, and dates agreed on when they will be achieved. I also think that it's important to highlight during the introduction to service space, which is when the transition actually starts happening, my experience has always been that never go for a single big bang because that is effectively unachievable. It is important to plan out and identify how you can chunk up either portions of the capability. So if you have a high level capability that is made of sub capabilities, can elements of those be transitioned to support earlier than others? Can distinct support system constituent capabilities be transitioned earlier than others? So a lot of the time in the past, we've found an obvious first candidate for transition is the miller's work, the inventory support. The last couple of projects I've worked on, we've leaned heavily on the sustainment organization right from the get-go to support the project in codification, cataloging, receipt of equipment issue, etc. That very much lends itself to almost as soon as equipment has arrived at units, in a lot of cases, the transition of inventory management responsibility can move across. Finessing the details of how you are going to manage a multi-phased introduction to service. So if you do a regional distribution, we do Queensland first half of 2021, we do Northern Territory second half of 2021, how you manage the transition of responsibility when over the space of possibly multiple years, you are delivering into service chunks of the same capability. That is a sort of conversation that needs to be discussed and agreed during those transition review meetings. However, I've always been a fan of aim to transition early rather than later, because once the system is in sustainment and portions of the fleet are being supported in sustainment, the best organization for that is usually going to be the sustainment organization. But again, don't go for a big bang transition approach. And there'll be some elements where you might want to do joint management together. So again, contractual management responsibility is one that I've found shouldn't be done straight away. And my experience has been that once you have the support contract running and you've achieved operative date, usually I'll try and recommend that the project maintains contractual responsibility and management of that support contract for the first at least 6 months, depending on the scope and scale of the contract. It may be longer, it may be shorter, but 6 months is generally the sweet spot of my experience of it remains the project responsibility. during that 6-month period, sustainment or the sustainment contract manager should be involved and providing input, attending contract status reviews and the like with the support contractor. And then you try and do a gradual handover where they become the contract representative for some or all of the support contract responsibility. And project supports that for another 6 months, and then you ease off and let sustainment run with it. Again, depending on the skills, experience, commercial understanding of that type of support contract that the sustainment organisation has, it may lend itself towards more involvement and more support or less, again, depending on the experience. Other areas of that progressive transition that I've learnt warrant particular thinking about. Most capability rollouts, again, are going to be progressive, where you'll have, whether it's regional based or whether it's tranche 1 rollout is capability points 1, 2, and 3, tranche 2 to the same units is 4, 5, and 6. But in most cases, it won't be all the equipment is gone, rollout's now finished, end of story. In that space, engineering support, configuration management of the capability is very important to closely manage and engage the sustainment team early. I'm currently still trying to work out how we are going to manage the engineering support transition of a capability I'm working on at the moment, where it will be introduced and running and ideally managed by the sustainment engineering organisation, whilst the acquisition organisation is still managing acceptance of the second system, which could plausibly go through further engineering change and configuration management. Balancing that engineering support for a known baseline that's already been accepted versus part of the same fleet that hasn't arrived yet and could go through other changes is something that needs to be very closely monitored and managed. And again, that should never be done in isolation by the project. Key message, as always, is engage the sustainment organisation, make sure there are no surprises, make sure you take their thoughts and their requirements on board. Otherwise, there will be difficulty later on when they try and receive something that they have not had input into and that they may not understand what the thought process is that arrived at what they have been asked to accept responsibility for. Last point on this particular slide was the overall time frame of transition. Generally speaking, as mentioned before, my preference is to try and have transition starting pretty much as soon as you achieve initial material release or IOC. It needs to be finished by final operating capability for a project to close. I generally don't want to have it open until that point, but that's the no later than it must be finished date. Okay, before we move on, any other thoughts, comments, questions, stories on transition during the acquisition, in-service and disposal phases? Okay. So next slide was key stakeholders that should be engaged in transition planning. A lot of these are going to be very obvious, of course, you know, project manager, the SPO. It's still worth running through the list to actually make sure that people think about all of these. Some of them are very obvious, some of them may be less so. In the project team, on the project side, when you read the CASG policy and guidance, transition planning is actually the responsibility of the project manager, but in very most cases, it will be heavily supported by or led by the ILS manager of the project team. And that tends to move from the project manager at the earlier stages of the capability lifecycle more and more towards the ILS manager as you progress through from the strategic planning through to the tactical planning and management. There will often be a transition manager that is involved as well, because particularly once you're in the acquisition and in-service space, the amount of time, effort, and thought that is required to manage and control the transition process is quite extensive. And in a lot of cases, that would warrant at least a part-time transition manager who can solely focus on, a good portion of their time and effort on managing the transition. Again, what I found in the past is both Project Office and the Sustainment organization, the ones that work best are where both acquisition and sustainment actually assign their own lead transition manager for delivering transition and receiving transition to work together and manage the process collectively. That was the most successful transition activity that I've worked with, and I highly recommend it, assuming that project and sustainment is actually able to resource and support that, which is always a caveat when you're looking at work allocation. In the sustainment organization, it's key to make sure that when you're engaging, you engage with all of the respective areas that need to receive transition. There will usually be a lead stakeholder that has been identified, whether that be the fleet manager, the product manager, I think is the current terminology, or a separate person to manage transition as mentioned before. But receiving transition, it'll be important to engage with and get acceptance in their discrete areas of transition they're going to receive from project manager, finance, commercial, engineering, logistics. The reason being they are all responsible for different portions of the support system, and they all need to be familiar with what the support arrangements are that they are going to have to receive. Product manager is the obvious one because they are responsible for the fleet overall. And finance has key interest because the support arrangements, particularly the contractual support arrangements, need to be affordable. They need to fit within the material sustainment agreement forecast budget and spend spread. Commercial, from the contracting support avenue, is the support organization in a position to be able to manage that type of contract. Engineering, someone needs to take over ongoing engineering configuration management responsibility, and logistics from the miller standpoint. If you're dealing with more classified systems, maybe cards. I think health systems have their own inventory management system as well. But all of those branches of a support organization need to be involved. In some SPOs, you might find there are one person or one sub-organization covers multiple aspects of those branches, but all of them need to be considered. Likewise, in the project team, you'll usually have specialists that provide input on engineering, logistics, commercial, etc., but they would all be coordinated by the transition manager, and they would all support the lower level monthly transition workshops or the formal quarterly transition review meetings as required and depending on what the agenda of any specific meeting needs to cover. It's also very important to include the user representative. When you're in the project space, and I'll talk to Army at the moment because that's what I know and am familiar with. I would assume that Navy and RAF have similar requirements and similar organizational structures to support this, but I can't say that I know and have dealt with that. But on the Army side, you've got the acquisition capability manager who will be driving the MAA requirements, which in a lot of cases in the past, from my experience, have included when support arrangements need to be established, i.e., is there a difference between IMR, Material Release 1, 2, 3, IOC, different operational capability states progressing forwards. That provides the framework within which your overall transition timeline needs to sit. The capability manager also needs to identify and provide an introduction to service directive, which again lays out in broad, not just the acceptance into operational service or capability rollout, but the transition of support needs to fit within that broader framework as well. There is also a section of Army that specifically is focused on the sustainment. So much like we've got the capability manager on the acquisition side, there is the Army Fleet Management or DLOG-A support organization for sustainment. they should be involved in planning, in reviews, in that transition process. Most of the detail would be left to the SPO and the project organisation, but ARMI needs to be across it and in agreement with what is happening and an understanding of what is happening. Last but not least is obviously the executive. So the SPO director, if you are part of a program, the program director as well, because they will be the ultimate authority that actually signs off to say, yes, we are accepting this transition planning, and yes, we're accepting that this partial or complete transition has now been completed and can be signed off on the transition certificate, closed, job done. Those are the list of all the transition stakeholders that I could think up off the top of my head and that we have been engaging with in the past. Has anybody got any other thoughts or individuals, organizations that you believe should be engaged when planning for and executing transition? Whether that be, you know, you might occasionally need to talk to these people, or this is an organization that needs heavy engagement going all the way through. Any comments from those listening in? About any input or thoughts on Navy or Air Force? Because again, that's the area I don't have quite so much experience. Is there anything different in there that anyone would like to share? Okay. I didn't think I sent it that way. All right. In terms of useful resources, so this is just a list of areas that I've found, or organizations I've found, that are very useful in helping you work out how to plan, how to execute, how to manage the transition process. The first one is just the reference. This is where you find the current CASG policy and guidance on how to do transition planning and management. The CASG business management system, if you go into the material logistics function and then transition planning, there's a whole lot of guidance around what considerations should be taken into account, what stakeholders should be engaged at each stage of the capability life cycle. There's also the product manager toolbox on the side, and if you open that up, there is transition plan templates, there are transition checklists, and there is a standing agenda template and a transition register template that, you know, you should use as the starting point of planning for and managing transition. Other one is obviously the receiving SPO. I've always found it extraordinarily useful simply to talk to the product manager, the fleet manager, the engineering manager of the SPO that you are transitioning to. Again, in part because they need to be familiar with what you are going to be transitioning them, but a lot of the times sustainment organizations will have been through the transition process previously. They will have their own lessons learned. They will have their own expectations on what they believe needs to be done by when in order for transition to be successful. In one of the previous cases, I was even given, here is the last transition plan. We really liked this. Can we do this again? So talking to your receiving SPO early on can help short circuit the process a lot, or at the very least identify areas where you need to pay particular attention to, because maybe their previous transition process doesn't really align with what you need to be doing in the project, and that is a difference that needs to be worked through and managed. There's also obviously talk with other similar projects and SPOs, because again, transition isn't new. All projects at some point have to transition, and all SPOs have taken over responsibility from someone. So whilst the CASG strategic guidance is continuously evolving and will provide you updated templates, guidance, etc., it is still worth looking at existing project SPOs to find out what they have learned, what templates they might have that you can leverage off of. In particular, the lead up to Gate 2 transition plan is quite boilerplate, and I believe once it has been developed for one project, if you find something similar to it, can be leveraged off to a very great extent. without having to reinvent the wheel. So talk to other peers, projects, SPOs. If you have any questions now, feel free to ask those, or flick an email at the end of the day and we can, or end of the session, and can come back. But other projects, other SPOs, peers, talk to the material logistics function, because they own the transition policy templates and they can provide you information as well. Any questions, comments, anything anyone would like to share on useful resources with the broader forum? Okay. All right. So conclusion of that, don't plan for a single big bang transition process, because you will either try and do it and fail, or you'll be waiting forever and a day, because transition is a very complex thing, and chunking it up into bite-sized pieces is far more likely to allow you to succeed. And it also allows you to focus in on those areas that are going to be problematic moving forwards. Identify stakeholders and engage with them early, in particular the sustainment organization, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to say, yes, I'm happy to accept responsibility, or no, I'm not. Also, always keep in mind that there are likely to be multiple sustainment organizations that you have to transition to. Most capabilities I've dealt with, there has been a single key SPO who take on 90–95% of the capability, but there have been common items that we have been buying, supporting, that get rolled out to increase the broader fleet, but they will be supported by someone else. Being that I've been in joint systems in the electronic space, BCOG, the batteries area, they are almost always an organization I have to deal with, because anything electric is probably, anything portable electric is probably going to need to deal with BCOG in one way or another for the batteries and chargers. Systems that require common tools, common support and test equipment. So key thing there is make sure that you know who the support organizations you need to deal with are, because it probably will be more than just one. And they will all have their own requirements. They will all have their own sustainment budget that you need to look at and think about. Think about what sustainment resourcing requirements will need to be in place once transition is happening, whether that be, are there enough people from a pure numbers sense, or whether that be the support organization needs to be able to go through a change process to position themselves to be able to manage what you're introducing. And I can't see that. Cool. And then, the last one is plan and resource the transition management as part of the Gate 2 schedule and cost model. Again, if you haven't planned for having the resources and the money to be able to manage that transition process, after you pass Gate 2, it's too late, and you have to go scrambling to try and find the resourcing, find the time in the schedule. It's much easier if you plan, again, even in broad brush terms, prior to Gate 2, and get something into the budget. It's always easier to hand back money than ask for more. All right. Okay, so that is the end of all of the specific information that I had listed to share. Thank you everyone for dialing in. Does anybody have any questions for myself, for the rest of the forum? Anything you'd like to share just in general? Okay. If anyone would like to follow up on anything not as part of this group, feel free to reach out to me. My email at work is just tim.webster@AeroPM, aeropm.com, no, aeropm.net, tim.webster@aeropm.net. If you have any questions or would like to follow up on anything that I've been through, please feel free to reach out with questions. Thank you for dialing in. I hope it was useful. keep an eye out for our next AeroPM Learning Together sessions. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you.